My Gavan and Melanine, and well met indeed. I am Arakir Galajerthan, the head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, and welcome back to another Lord of the Rings lore video. Today we deal with the Sons of Feanor, the Seven. Now, a few things to say before we begin. First, unrelated to lore, then a few things that you'll need to know about this before we dive in, and the process we're going to go through here, and then finally we'll kick off. So first and foremost, obviously this video is a day late. I absolutely ballsed up with the video yesterday and merged two videos that were not correct together, so that's why we're a day late for those watching it right now. The next point to say is that, as ever, this is designed mostly as a podcast rather than an actual video. The images in the background, as ever, are not created by me. They're found from the web. If you have any qualms with me using an image that might have been created by you, let me know. We will sort that out through through communication. But, of course, there aren't really very many images, and watching it's not really the way forward because it's difficult to give something in the background to observe. So instead, it's mostly just to be heard rather than seen, if you will. But without any further ado then, let's dive into what you might need to know. So, we're continuing on from the death of Feanor in the previous lore video. So some key things that you'll need to know about the Seven are as follows. This is the only real backstory you need to know, and what you'll need to know is, of course, that the Seven Sons of Feanor are bound by their oath. And their oath is to reclaim the Silmaril and to let none but themselves hold and claim ownership of the three Silmarils. Silmarils. That is their oath, and they have each sworn to this oath, such that they shall not rest until the oath is fulfilled. Additionally, they are all subject to the doom of Maedhros, which essentially means that they are all banished. They can ne'er to return to the lands of Aman, for the Seven are banished along with the other Noldor that made the trip. And finally, the only real story that you'll need to know the background to, because a lot of things here I will omit. We are dealing purely with the Sons, not with major events that happen. I'll explain that a bit more in a moment, but the only real key story that you need to know before we go into this is that of Beren and Luthien. Now, Beren and Luthien are very topical at the moment because the book of Beren and Luthien has just come out. But all you need to know in this, a brief background of Beren and Luthien, are that Beren is a mortal man and Luthien is she's actually a half-elf, half-Maya. But, so she's an elf. She's said to be the most beautiful creature that basically ever existed. And Beren and Luthien fall in love with each other, and Beren goes to her father, Eleuthingol, and she says, I want to marry your daughter. Please, may I? And he says, no, you're never going to be good enough for my daughter. So he gives him this impossible quest, and he says to Beren, you can have my daughter's hand in marriage if you reclaim one of the Silmarils. Now note that the three Silmarils are currently in a crown on Melkor's head, and they stay there for almost the entire duration of the First Age, and the age that the Noldor stay in Beleriand. So this is an absolutely impossible task, but Beren sets out, and he loves Luthien, so he's going to go and get one of these Silmarils. And the story of Beren and Luthien intertwines with a few of the sons as it goes along. And I have included that image just there because it's a well-known thing that on the very gravestone of Edith and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, they have Beren and Luthien. Now, that's not to say that he modelled his relationship with Edith off of Beren and Luthien, but it's there for all to see that they call themselves that. And there's a cracking quote in the start of the Beren and Luthien book about how the tale has gone skewed because, sadly, Edith died before Tolkien. But anyway, so the Seven Sons then. So, well, the first thing to do really is going to be to tell you who the Seven Sons are. So in age order, they are Maedhros, Maglor, Kelegorm, Caranthir, Curufin, Amrod, and Amras. I may have got Kelegorm and Caranthir the wrong way around there, but it matters not really for the tale of the story. Also, all of the sons, three of them don't really have any unique events to them. So Caranthir, Amrod, and Amras, whilst Caranthir does have a small story, but it's not anywhere near as big as the others, and Amrod and Amras partake in virtually no unique events. They are very much swept under the rug, and they're not. They could just as well have not been part of the Sons, and it wouldn't have made too much difference. But we will start in this video by talking about each of the Sons in turn. And as I say, I will not cover certain key events that the sons partake in, because they will likely be in their own videos. So, particularly, a major theme, obviously, in this episode is the Dagor Bragollach, and I will discuss it in brief, along with the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, but I won't go into any great detail, because those could easily have their own videos. So it'll just be about the sons and their involvement. So, that's all you need to know. Let's crack on. And we're going to start, first of all, with just a general events, and then we'll deal with Maedhros and Maglor first, then Kelegorm and Curufin, and then finally Caranthir, Amrod, and Amras. So, in immediate aftermath after the fall of Feanor, after his death, the Noldor, what was left of them, moved south. They moved away from Melkor in the north, and then moved down the River Sirion, I believe, until they met up with the Sindar. Sindar, of course, being the elves who didn't cross the sea to Aman and reside within Beleriand. The Sindar chiefly live within the forest of Doriath and the city of Nargothrond. So the Noldor meet the Sindar, and the Sindar believe them to be emissaries of the Valar, and there is great joy at their returning to Middle-earth, because, of course, the Sindar have no knowledge of the doom of Mandos, the kin-slaying of Alqualonde, and the purpose of the Noldor here. They don't realise that these Noldor are actually really the harbingers of doom rather than the bringers of peace. So there's great joy at their return. But this joy is short-lived. And Melkor, the great enemy, he sends an emissary down to the Noldor that remain, and he offers them terms. He even suggests that he will surrender their precious Silmaril to them, if they essentially but leave him be. And he asks them to set up talks. He wants to meet with the sons of Feanor and discuss events in Middle-earth, basically. Now Maedhros, realising that this is a trap, he persuades the other Noldor to agree to this meeting, but use it as an opportunity to betray Melkor and attack him. Unfortunately for Maedhros and all the Noldor, Melkor has exactly the same plan. So they both sides agree to meet to discuss the future of Middle-earth, as it were. And unfortunately, whilst the sons and the Noldor have brought with them an army of great size and strength, Melkor's brought an even bigger one. And this is one of the first and very few defeats of the Noldor. And Melkor captures Maedhros. Maedhros and the Noldor's army is slain, and Maedhros' army is slain. The sons are not, they escape, but Maedhros is captured. And this is where we then start talking about Maedhros individually. And we now break off into each son's story. So, to deal with Maedhros then. So the rest of the sons, just to finish with those, they head back south. They set up a camp in the south. And they bide their time. Now, Maedhros himself is taken back to Angband, the great fortress in the north where Melkor resides, under the peaks of the Thangorodrim. And Melkor holds him as a prisoner, but he holds him, and he will not release Maedhros unless the Noldor promise to leave Middle-earth and go back to Aman. Basically, leave Middle-earth to Melkor. Because Melkor is clever, he's intelligent, and he knows that the Noldor are the strongest, most fearsome, and most intelligent of the elves that have come to Middle-earth. He knows that the Vanyar, who are arguably stronger and better than the Noldor, debatable, they aren't bothered with Middle-earth, but the Noldor are here to kill him. They're a problem, and the easiest way to get rid of them is to just send them away straight away. So he says, I'll give you Maedhros back if you all, essentially, bugger off. Now, of course, the Noldor don't do this. They're under oath, and they're banished, so they can't really go back. So, realising that Maedhros isn't going to get anywhere with this, Melkor is going to get anywhere with this, he ties Maedhros to the very face of the mountains itself, and he chains him there, as you can see from the image, with a connection only to his right wrist. Maedhros hangs from the very sheer face of the Thangorodrim, the three peaks above Angband, bound only by his right wrist. And he stays in this way for a very, very long time. And just a brief tangent from the story. This also therefore suggests that whilst elves are immortal, they also cannot die of starvation nor thirst. Because Maedhros is up there for an incredibly long time. Far longer than a human would survive. And obviously he never dies. And so this is either Melkor's magic or elves just don't die of starvation or thirst either. So Maedhros hangs from the face of the mountains. But his saviour does eventually come. Now, Fingon, the first son, the eldest son of Fingolfin, the brother of Feanor, therefore Maedhros' cousin, he wants to heal the feud that has divided the Noldor after both sides arrived. So if you remember, half of the Noldor sailed to Middle-earth under Feanor, but then he burnt the ships. And the other half were abandoned by Feanor, and they crossed the Helcarax and came to Middle-earth from the north. They lost many people in this crossing, and a hatred, a sort of simmering hatred, broke the Noldor in two, with the half that were abandoned and the half that went forth first. So Fingon wants to try and heal this break between the two sides of the Noldor. And he thinks finding Maedhros and bringing him back is going to be a great way to do this. So he sets out alone to find Maedhros. Now, using a great smog-like, cloud-like covering that Melkor is using himself to cover his own forces, Fingon is able to slip all the way up the Anfalglith, the great plain in front of the Thangorodrim, all the way to the mountains itself. He doesn't get seen at all. He climbs the mountain and he begins searching for Maedhros. Now, this doesn't go very well at all. He just doesn't find him. And fearing that he's never going to find Maedhros and his search has been in vain, in utter frustration and to defy the very evil that lurks just kilometers, meters beneath the earth that he stands upon, he begins to play music. Now, none of the servants of Melkor hear the music, or if they do, they don't get there in time, but Maedhros does, and Maedhros, against all the odds, begins singing to the tune Fingon plays. And from this sound, Fingon is able to find Maedhros, so he climbs up the mountain to where Maedhros is hanging, but he realises that Melkor has literally put him on a sheer cliff face. He cannot reach Maedhros. There's a discussion between the two, and Fingon weeps. He cries, realising that after all this, his quest is still in vain. And Maedhros begs him. He says, "Fingon, kill me." So Fingon, against all that he has come to do, cries out to Manwë. And he cries to Manwë for support and assistance. And he says, "How can you abandon us? How can you do this to us? And help me save Maedhros." And his prayer is answered outrageously quickly. I mean, this is one of those parts of the story where you just don't think about the logistics of it. But immediately after calling for assistance, Thorondor, the king of the eagles, greater even than Gwaihir of the Third Age, Thorondor appears in the sky, flies down, and carries Fingon up to where Maedhros is found. Hence the image in front of you. Now, there's another barrier. Fingon realises that he cannot cut the chain that binds Maedhros to the wall. And Maedhros again says, "Fingon, just kill me. Just please kill me now." But Fingon says, "No, I'm not going to kill you. I've come all this bloody way. I'm not just going to abandon you now." So instead, he cuts Maedhros' right arm off. And Thorondor then flies them both back to the Noldorine encampment near Lake Mithrim. Now, Maedhros heals from this unfortunate problem. He obviously doesn't grow his arm back, but he heals from his torment and his torture because his spirit is of fire. Let's not forget that the father of all of these sons was arguably the most strongest, hardiest, determined elf ever to exist, and much of that spirit passes to the sons. And Maedhros is able to make a full recovery, save for the fact that he only has one arm from then on out. The hurt that did exist between the two groups of the Noldor is assuaged, and Maedhros waves his claim to the High Kingship in honour of what Fingon has done. Because, of course, the High Kingship passes father to son, not brother to brother. And so when Feanor died, Maedhros became the High King of the Noldor in exile. But Maedhros gives up this claim, and Fingolfin becomes the High King of the Noldor in exile, the father of Fingon, the saviour of Maedhros. So, with the Noldor finally all together, Maedhros back, Maedhros and all of the sons, it has to be said at this point, they all then head to the east. For fear of strife between them and the Sindar, and also fear of strife between the 7 sons of Feanor and the sons of Fingolfin and Finarfin, the 7 sons of Feanor head east, and they take those Noldor loyal to them with them. But the sons of Fingolfin and Finarfin, they stay, they set up different kingdoms, their stories now part ways. So we're sticking with the 7. So they head off to the east to the lands that become known as the March of Maedhros. You can see them there in the top right-hand side. And Maedhros himself sets himself up on the hill of Himring, which is just in off-centre there. And that becomes his domain. And all the Noldor that come with them, this is where they live. From the south, where you can see the River Asgar, I wonder if you can see my cursor. From the River Asgar down here, this whole northern section to the borders of Doriath, up past the River Kellon, and all the way to Lothlan. This is the land of the Sons of Feanor. Now, after around 20 years or so, peace has reigned, Melkor has been quiet, and Fingolfin called a great feast of all elves. Sindar, Noldor, all elves come together to Fingolfin in this great feast. Now, Maedhros does attend this, but nothing particularly special happens there. They just celebrate and rejoice. It's one of the few times that he leaves the marches of Maedhros, so it's worth mentioning. Now, a little while after this feast, around 30 or so years-ish, I've got written down here, Melkor Morgoth wants to then test the strength of his enemies now that they've set up in various places. And this culminates in what is the third battle of the battles of Beleriand. The Dagor Bragollach. Now, the Dagor Bragollach means glorious battle. And this is because Melkor ushers forth his entire force, save for some of the beasties he's holding back for a little later. But he ushers his whole orc host out, and they are utterly obliterated. The Noldor and the Sindar together ruin Melkor's army, and it is an overwhelming victory for the elves. And the two leaders of this elven army are Fingolfin and Maedhros. And together they destroy Melkor's force, and so much so that they then besiege the Thangorodrim. For countless years they then besiege the very mountains themselves. Peace reigns in Beleriand, for the walls of Angband, the Thangorodrim, are besieged. And the orcs are trapped within their mountain hold. However, the mountains are so great that the elves will never break in. And this, unfortunately, factors into their demise a little later on. A spoiler alert. And speaking of, so for the next, as I say, countless years, I think it's hundreds, possibly even 1,000 years or something stupid like that, they besiege the Thangorodrim. And that's all Maedhros does in this time. Remember, we're dealing with each brother in turn, rather than dealing with what happens to them all chronologically. So the next event for Maedhros, after besieging the Thangorodrim for all these years and just maintaining a watch over it, then comes the first great disaster of the First Age, the Dagor Bragollach. Now, this one I will deal with in a little bit more detail because it affects all the sons. Now, the Dagor Bragollach means the Battle of Sudden Flame. And this is because there is the siege, the great encampment around the Thangorodrim, and it's keeping the orcs at check, at bay, in check. And out of absolutely nowhere, in sudden and outrageous onslaught, Melkor breaks out of the Thangorodrim and he floods the plains around his mountain home with fire. He literally sets fire to the very ground itself almost, ushers forth this flame, and coming on the spur of this great fiery onslaught are the Balrogs. So his great flaming demons, and behind them are his forces, and his army just expends out of Thangorodrim and breaks the siege. Countless elves are killed, and they are all beaten back to their various areas. It should also be noted that at this time, Glaurung the dragon also breaks out with them at this Dagor Bragollach, and this is the first time that we see a dragon. And with Glaurung being the first, in fact. And this is where, with the fire, with Balrogs, with a great dragon, they break the siege of Angband in the Dagor Bragollach. Now, at this time, at the Dagor Bragollach, as I say, the elves are all beaten back to their various areas, and the sons of Feanor are all beaten back to their land. And all, save for Maedhros and Maglor, are ousted from their various domains. So if you recall, Maedhros resides upon the hill of Himring. And it is said that in the battle, he himself fought as if he was a great flame. And the hill of Himring does not fall. The orcs completely flood the march of Maedhros, all of Lothlan, right down to the rivers of Assyrian. But the hill of Himring remains, and Maedhros and Maglor defend it together. Even with Glaurung coming upon the east and the orcs with him, they never take the Hill of Himring, and Maedhros endures. Eventually, the orcs are beaten back. There's a little bit more peace. And the next time we catch up with Maedhros again, unfortunately, is another key event, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Now, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad means the Battle of Unnumbered Tears because of how unfortunate of a loss it is. But in the build-up to the Nirnaeth and in the build-up to this event for Maedhros, there's a few things to note. The first is the coming of the Easterlings. Now, the Easterlings are humans, but they're not the Easterlings that we know of in the Third Age. They are Easterlings because they come from the east of Beleriand. So they come from just Middle-earth, like central Middle-earth. Now, unbeknownst to Maedhros and Maglor, some of these Easterling men are already under the sway of Melkor. Melkor has basically bribed, promised, begged them to come and assist him, but to appear as if they're going to assist the elves. So the Eastlings come into the lands around the March of Maedhros. And they begin mingling with the elves and they begin a union. Now, out of this initial union with the humans, and also owing to the success of Beren and Luthien, do note, Beren succeeds, spoiler alert, in taking a Silmaril from the head of Melkor, Sauron. Although he does need Luthien's help. But so, buoyed by the success of Beren, buoyed by the coming of all these Easterlings, Maedhros seeks to create a great union, and it's called the Union of Maedhros. And what he hopes to do here is, after the Dagor Bragollach has receded, a kind of peace has been restored. He tries to call together all elves, dwarves, and men of Beleriand to finally put Melkor down. Now, unfortunately, not that many elves actually come to his banner. Owing to various events of his brothers, various elven lords do not trust the Sons of Feanor, and very little help actually comes from Nargothrond or Doriath. But the dwarves answer the call, and the loyal men of the West answer the call as well, those that will go on to be the Edain. So a great host is assembled, and a great plan is also then thought up to create a hammer and anvil style attack. From the west, from Tol Sirion and the River Sirion, from that side, will come a great force heading up to draw out the forces of Melkor. And then when Melkor is fully engaged, Maedhros and his huge army will then come in on the east, and they'll catch the armies of Melkor in the crossfire, and they will destroy his army and destroy him once and for all. However, treachery ensues because one of the leaders of the Easterlings, a man called Uldor, he begins whispering and lying to Maedhros, suggesting that they need to delay their attack for this reason, for that reason, for the other. And Maedhros unfortunately listens to him. And so Maedhros and his force come upon the Melkor's army a little too late for the hammer and anvil attack, and instead it turns into somewhat of a massacre. This massacre is made all the worse because when they arrive in battle with the orcs, then the Easterlings hatch their unfortunate plan, and they begin attacking the elves from behind. So the elves are then trapped with the orcs coming from Thangorodrim, and the Easterlings now turned against them coming from behind. Now, it should be noted, though, that in the fray and in the maelstrom, Maglor does kill Uldor, the traitorous human who delayed the attack of Maedhros. Also, of course, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad is the battle in which Glaurung is wounded by Azaghal, the great dwarven king. But as I say, I won't go into too much detail about the battle itself. So the battle, which was so close to being an outrageous success, turns into an utter disaster, and the Seven Sons do all escape, and they flee to the east to Mount Dolmed. Now, you will see a few more maps in a moment, and I will talk through those, but they're a bit more pertinent to other sons' stories. So. Right, so Maedhros and the other sons all flee to Mount Dolmed, but there's a very large gap now where they don't really partake in the events of Beleriand. Lots of things happen, but the sons don't get involved, and the next time that Maedhros and Maglor enter back into the story is unfortunately with their oath. Maedhros hears the news that the Silmaril that was taken by Beren is being worn by Dior in Doriath, the current ruler of Doriath. So the brothers come together and they ask very nicely, first of all. They send a message asking essentially, that Silmaril is rightfully ours. Please give it up. Oh, sorry, I didn't swap to the Nirnaeth Arnoediad image. Yeah. My bad. So they come to Dior and they say, we would like the Silmaril back. It's rightfully ours. Please give it up. Now, Dior says no. He denies them this because the Silmaril has this power to create great want in whoever wears it. Almost everyone who comes into contact with the Silmaril then desires to hold it forever and is corrupted in one way or another. And Dior says no. And unfortunately, the sons, controlled by their oath, attack Doriath. And this is the second kin-slaying of the elves. The first being at Alqualonde. Dior is killed. His wife Nimloth is also slain. And Doriath is ruined by its own people. The elves destroy Doriath. But the Silmaril does not go into the hands of Maedhros. It manages to escape. Because the Silmaril escapes with Elwing, Dior's daughter, and the mother of Elrond and Elros. So Maedhros and his brothers attack Doriath. There's a great fight, a great battle ensues. The Noldor are there with them. And Dior is slain, his wife is slain, but his daughter escapes with the Silmaril, and the son's quest again is fruitless. So there's another period of time where they languish, where they wait. But then they hear that Elwing has managed to escape further south to the havens on the coast with the Philathrim. And she now has the Silmaril. And again, Maedhros, moved on by his great oath, again requests the Silmaril. And is again denied. And once again, he attacks. And Maedhros, Maglor, the remaining sons, attack the havens, I believe the havens of Sirion, I think it may be called. I've forgotten the name, I apologise. But they attack again, and the third kin-slaying takes place. But once again, Maedhros is denied the Silmaril, for Elwing, fearing that these murderous elves should get this great thing of beauty, she casts herself with the Silmaril into the very ocean. But she does not die. For Ulmo himself, the Lord of Waters, takes pity on Elwing and transforms her into a great swan. And with the Silmaril, she flies up to her mariner husband, Eärendil, and she joins him on his ship. So the Silmaril again escapes Maedhros. Now, the sons then do not take part, well, they may well do, but we don't know what happens of them when Melkor is finally destroyed in the War of Wrath. But after the fall of Morgoth, when he is finally killed, Eonwe, the Herald of Manwë, he takes the Silmaril from Melkor when Melkor's defeated, and he holds on to them. And once more, Maedhros and Maglor come to Eonwe, and they say, these Silmarils are rightfully ours, give them up. And Eonwe says no. Eonwe says that these Silmarils are no longer yours, your oath has long since failed, essentially, and these will never be yours. But Maedhros can't repent. And he convinces Maglor that they should get the Silmaril back. And under the cover of night, they sneak into the encampment and they steal the Silmaril themselves. Now, as they begin leaving the camp is aroused. They attack the guards defending the Silmaril, but they become trapped. It's two of them versus the armies of Aman. This is the army that came to kill Melkor. There are Vanyar, there are probably Maya, there's Eonwe in all of this. And they try and take this whole camp on. It's Maedhros and Maglor against the world. But Eonwe says, no, hold. Let them go. Like, they've done all of this. They will never stop until these Silmarils are theirs, and let them see what folly they're about to enter into. And he lets them go. But Maedhros, Maglor, their story does not end well. For after their release, they begin wandering the lands and wandering the world, and Maedhros realizes very quickly that he can't touch the Silmaril. It burns him just to be in his possession. And realizing that it had all been folly, the number of people he had killed, all the things that he had done to claim these jewels that now he can't even hold, he can't bear to touch for the pain, Maedhros casts himself into a chasm. He throws himself with his Silmaril into a chasm, and he is therefore no longer heard from again. And indeed, his Silmaril passes out of the tail. Now, Maglor has the other Silmaril, and we'll deal with him in a little moment. But a little tangent here is that there is a theory knocking around the internet that this Silmaril that Maedhros jumps into a chasm with actually then somehow makes its way to become the Arkenstone. Now, this isn't a proven theory, but it's one of those really interesting theories where there's a few bits that do add up quite nicely. And the only jump you've got to make is somehow this Silmaril gets from wherever Maedhros throws himself into a chasm all the way to Erebor. So there's a little side note for you. Now, Maglor, moving on now. So that's the end of Maedhros' tale with his death. Now, speaking of Maglor, his events are basically completely linked to Maedhros, which is why I've barely mentioned him. But the only things that you can say about Maglor on his own is that he is considered the second greatest singer in all of Middle-earth. That is his great claim to fame. But his story is completely intertwined with his brother. So almost everything Maedhros does after he is rescued from the peaks of Thangorodrim, Maglor does with him. So he's present at both Kin-slayings, all three battles, and he just follows in Maedhros' shadow, essentially. So then we move on to Kelegorm and Curufin. Now, Kelegorm is called the Fair, and is arguably the most beautiful of the sons of Feanor. And of course, Curufin is the crafty, and he is the creator, the greatest smith. He has inherited his father's ability to create more than any other. And of course, Curufin is also the father of Celebrimbor, the creator of the Rings of Power. But Kelegorm and Curufin's story, much like Maedhros and Maglor, is completely linked. These two do everything together. So if I will likely only say Kelegorm, but I mean Kelegorm and Curufin. It's just easier to say one name. Unless it's a specific event for Curufin, we'll deal with Kelegorm. Now, one of the key things to note here before we go on is that Kelegorm is one of the only sons who wasn't favoured by Aule, and was instead favoured by Arome, the wanderer, the hunter of the Valar. And it is from Arome, indeed, that Kelegorm comes into possession of Huan. And we'll deal with Huan in a moment, because he's tied heavily into this story. But where the path of Kelegorm and Curufin passes away from the story of Maedhros and Maglor is at the Battle of Sudden Flame, the Dagor Bragollach, if you recall. This is when the siege of Angband is broken, flames cover the Amphalglyph that you can see in the north there, and the sons are all beaten back except for Maedhros and Maglor. So Kelegorm and Curufin, their land was where this fourth arrow along was. This is called the Pass of Aglon, and it's a small gap between the hills here and the mountains here. And this is where they reinforce. But in the Dagor Bragollach, their fortress is overrun and they are beaten back. And they flee all the way south to the city of Nargothrond, where Finrod Felagund rules. Finrod, of course, being their cousin. So they reside in Nargothrond for quite a while, until the arrival of he who must not be named, Beren. Now, of course, Beren comes to Nargothrond at the start of his quest, when he is first setting out to get the Silmaril. He's been told by Thingol that he's not going to get Luthien until he gets this Silmaril, and so he sets out. And he first stops off at Nargothrond, where he asks for aid. He beseeches Finrod to assist him. And originally Finrod says no. But at this time as well, Beren comes across Kelegorm, and Kelegorm warns him. He says, if you come across that Silmaril, then you must give it to us. It is rightfully ours. Do not hold on to it for yourself. But Beren says no. And Beren says he's not afraid of Kelegorm. And Kelegorm essentially threatens him. So there's no love lost between these two. And this develops even further as we go along. So whilst Kelegorm and Curufin are in Nargothrond, Beren's already now gone. A great unease comes upon the kingdom. And they begin trying to gain support from the people within the city. And they even hatch somewhat of a plan to seize the very throne of Nargothrond itself. However, before this is actually possible and they can usurp their own cousin, Finrod abdicates and he leaves Nargothrond with 10 companions, and he goes to assist Beren in his quest. But he doesn't pass the kingship to Kelegorm or Curufin. He passes it to Orodreth, his own brother. So Orodreth becomes the king of Nargothrond. But Kelegorm and Curufin are now gaining even more support within the city. And there's something of a strife brewing within the city itself. But a little while later, Luthien comes into the tale. For whilst Beren is off at the initial stages of the quest, Luthien is actually trapped by her own father. She's imprisoned in a treehouse atop the tallest tree in the great forest of Neldareth. But she is insistent that she wants to assist Beren, so she escapes this treetop prison, only to be found by Huan, the great hound of Arome and now the hound of Kelegorm. Now, a side note about Huan, he came from Valinor and was gifted to Kelegorm by Arome, as I say. And it was said that Huan would share in the fate of the Noldor. He was like the Noldor with the doom of Maedhros, and he was loyal to Kelegorm through the Kin-slaying even. It was also almost prophesied that he would not die until he had met the greatest wolf that had ever lived. And do note that Huan is a hound, he's a dog, he isn't a wolf, but he is a great hound, able to be ridden by humans. But anyway, back to Luthien. So she escapes this treetop prison and she's found by Huan, and he brings her back to Kelegorm. And she throws off her cloak, and Kelegorm is immediately ensnared and enthralled by her beauty, as almost all are that meet her. But Kelegorm is one of the few that's really verging on like stalker level attraction to Luthien. And he bids that she return to Nargothrond with him, and she agrees. And however, as soon as they arrive back in the city, she realizes that this is essentially a trap, because Kelegorm immediately imprisons her again. So she's fled the tree, only to be ensnared in Nargothrond. And Kelegorm hatches a plan to get Thingol to give Luthien to him as his bride. However, Huan is now fearing and facing split loyalty. Huan is completely loyal to Kelegorm, except he cannot stomach the treatment that Luthien is going through. She is literally imprisoned. She is locked away when she's in Nargothrond, and Huan often comes to speak with her. For Huan can understand the language of many of Middle-earth, but he is only permitted to speak 3 times. But he listens to Luthien. He just comes to her night after night, and he listens to her. He hears her tale. He sees her beauty. And he just, eventually his loyalties split. The line breaks, and Huan helps Luthien escape. And she and Huan then ride north to assist Beren, because at this point they have learnt that Beren has been captured by Sauron, and he and Finrod Felagund are languishing in the prisons of Tol Sirion. Or I believe it's called Tol Imgorhoth now. Isn't that the name that Sauron gives it, the Isle of Werewolves? And he's imprisoned in this island fortress. And Luthien and Huan together break Beren out, but Finrod Felagund dies in the prison. But Beren, Luthien and Huan and many captives then escape, and they go back to Nargothrond. Now this is the turning point for the brothers. Now at this stage, do note that the brothers hold de facto power over Nargothrond, despite the fact that Orodreth is still very much the king. The people do what Kelegorm says, they don't do what Orodreth says. But upon the arrival of Beren, Luthien and Huan, and the fact that Luthien was able to break into a fortress of the enemy, controlled by a Maya itself, Sauron, the people then, they can't believe that the brothers could not do with a small force what this maiden and hound have done on their own. And then the almost illusion breaks, and they realise that Kelegorm and Curufin haven't been speaking truth to them, and instead it was treachery and not fear that held the hands of Kelegorm and Curufin. So the people believed all this time that Kelegorm didn't assault Tol Sirion because he didn't have the army, he didn't have the strength, he didn't have the courage. But now they realised that it was never that, it was treachery. They desired Nargothrond for themselves, the brothers, and thus they stayed their hand in an attempt to become kings. And for this, the people rise up against them and banish them. The brothers are kicked out of Nargothrond. But Huan, ever the loyal hound, he goes with Kelegorm. He believes that his master can change, whatever his reasoning. He goes with Kelegorm and leaves Luthien and Beren behind. Now, side note for Curufin here, and about the only little individual bit about Curufin, is that Curufin's son, Celebrimbor, this is where they part ways. Celebrimbor actually repudiates the deeds of his fathers, his grandfather, and his people, and he stays in Nargothrond, and he no longer takes part in any of the events of the Noldor. And eventually, of course, he flees and sets up Eregion in the central lands of Middle-earth. But the brothers, as they are fleeing north, away from Nargothrond, they decide to go back to Maedhros, to the marches of Maedhros, because, of course, he stayed on the Hill of Himring. But as they're fleeing north, they come upon Beren and Luthien in the wilds. Now, break from the story, side note, the wolves were not present when this event went down, but I couldn't get a good enough image that showed the two brothers riding on horses. So as they are riding north, they come across Beren and Luthien, and Kelegorm now, he utterly hates Beren. Beren defied him the Silmaril. He defied him by taking this woman that Kelegorm believes is rightfully his. And they have now ousted him from the kingdom that he thought was his. So Kelegorm and Curufin set upon Beren and Luthien as if to kill them. And they charge down Beren. But as they are riding towards Beren, Curufin very sneakily turns his mount and he snatches Luthien up and begins riding off with Luthien. But Beren is apparently a renowned athleticist, a renowned acrobat, and he leaps from a standing position onto Curufin as he rides past with Luthien on his horse. Beren throttles Curufin, pulls him to the ground. He and Luthien, they're all on the floor, and Curufin is then being strangled by Beren. But whilst Beren is atop Curufin, killing him, Kelegorm is riding him down from unbeknownst to Beren. But before Kelegorm can kill Beren, Huan finally abandons his quite evil master and leaps in front of Kelegorm's charging horse, so the horse rears up and refuses to move. Kelegorm curses both his hound and his horse, but Huan will not move. However, Luthien forbade Huan from killing Kelegorm at this point. So instead, Beren takes all the weapons and gear from both of the elves. It basically robs them. And he takes an ancient dagger from Kelegorm called Angrist, which means iron blade, that was made by Telkar of Nogrod, one of the greatest dwarven smiths to ever live. And Beren claims this dagger as an heirloom for himself. And they also take the horses of Kelegorm and Curufin, robbing them completely blind. And Beren, Luthien and Huan then leave the brothers in the forest with nothing. But as they are riding away, Kelegorm, ever the evil bastard, if you pardon my French, he knocks an arrow and takes aim at Beren. No, sorry, he takes aim at Luthien. But Huan, seeing and sensing this impending doom, leaps in the way of the arrow and takes the arrow to his chest. Now, Huan does not die. He just catches he catches the arrow, sorry. I'm getting in right 2 and 8. However, Kelegorm, undeterred by the fact that Huan has caught out of midair his first arrow, he fires a second at Luthien. And this time, Beren jumps in the way. And he takes the shot in the chest. But Beren does not die. Worry not. But Kelegorm and Curufin finally then ride off after all of their attempts to kill these two that they utterly hate have passed. Kelegorm and Curufin then only come into the story once more with their demise. Now, I didn't mention this when this image came up the first time, but at the second Kin-slaying, after Beren is successful with the Silmaril and it makes its way to Dior in Doriath, and Maedhros rallies his brothers to assault Doriath, Curufin and Kelegorm are both killed in the attack on Doriath. And this is where they then fall out of the story. So next then we come on to Caranthir, the only brother who doesn't really join with any of the others. And this is also just a moment to show you a little bit of a better map to show where everyone escaped to. So the pass of Aglon here, that was where Kelegorm and Curufin set up. The Hill of Himring is where Maedhros set up, and the little angle here between Little and Greater Gelon is where Maglor resided. Amrod and Amras were further down in the south here around Amon-Areb and the River Askar, and this land of Thargelion is Caranthir's. Also, when the brothers fled in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, when it turned to utter dismay, Mount Dolmed is where they fled to. But we're looking at this image now because Caranthir and his story is very much intertwined with his land, Thargelion. So Caranthir, first of all, his epithet, if you will, if that's the right word, is the Dark. And he is actually considered the quickest to anger and angriest and most almost evil, for want of a better word, of all of the sons. And there are numerous times where he counsels Maedhros to do the slightly more aggressive action rather than a more peaceful one. But he himself only has a very small story. So Caranthir, like all the other brothers, takes part in the Dagor Bragollach and the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and of course the Kin-slaying. But before any of that, Thargelion, whilst he rules in Thargelion, some humans first make their way across the mountains. And these are called the Haladin. And the Haladin are led by a man called Haldad, and his sons Haldar and his daughter Haleth. His son Haldar, sorry. And the Haladin set up here in the lands around the River Askar and Mount Dolmed, in the far south reaches of Caranthir's realm. However, Melkor does not like the idea that humans are coming to fight with the elves, because he sees that as the only outcome here. Unless he's already swaying the humans to fight for him, they're going to fight for the elves, and he can't have that. So he sends orcs all the way out east, beyond the Ered Luin, back into Middle-earth, to then come back across the Ered Luin further south, such as to avoid the passes of the Noldor, which are held against the orcs. So when Haldad and his people, the Haladin, are setting up in Thargelion, the orcs attack. Now, the Haladin do not have a unified people. There's so many Hals in this, I'm getting all over the place. Haldad is a great chieftain of the Haladin, but they are not unified as a single nation, and they live in homesteads, very separated from one another. And they are easy picking for the orcs. But Haldad manages to rally those that he can, and they flee all the way south here to the San Athrad, to this crossing, this little angle between the River Askar and the River Gelion. And here in this little angle, they are besieged by the orcs, and it does not go well. Haldad and his son Haldar are both slain as they try to sally out to break the siege. And Haleth then becomes in command, the daughter of Haldad. Many of her people are slain, and then as their supplies begin to run out, many of their people even begin jumping in the river to their death, feeling that death at the hands of the water is better than the hands of the orcs. And 7 days after they are completely out of all of their supplies, the orcs finally break the walls of this encampment they'd set up. And as they do, the horns of Caranthir sound, and the army of the Noldor arrives, scatters the orcs utterly, and saves Haleth and the remaining Haladin. Caranthir then beseeches Haleth. He says, "Come back to the north with me. I can protect you far easier in the lands around Lake Helivorn and the Upper Gelion." But Haleth denies him. And she says no. And she then leads her people on an utterly treacherous trail. And they go from here all the way to their brothers in Hithlum. Many of her people die in this passing and this crossing, but she is remembered as a great leader of the Haladin. So Caranthir does not get these human allies in his lands. So then the Dagor Bragollach takes shape once again, and Caranthir's force from, as you can see, Thargelion are utterly routed, and he flees south to join with the Green Elves and his brothers Amrod and Amras down near Amon-Areb. And this is where he, Amrod and Amras, then reside. They stay here until they are called together for the attack on Doriath. Now, Caranthir also comes out of the tale here, only having been in it for very briefly. For at the attack on Doriath by Maedhros, Maglor, Kelegorm, Curufin, Caranthir, Amrod, and Amras, all three seas perish. So whilst it could be called the second Kin-slaying, it could also be called the killing of the seas. For Kelegorm, Curufin, and Caranthir all perish in the second Kin-slaying and the attack on Doriath. And therefore Caranthir's tale ends. And that brings us then finally onto the twins. And as I say, there is virtually nothing written about these two. All we know is that they are twins and that they have red hair very uncharacteristically for Noldor. Amrod and Amras are hunters. They are two of the only brothers that are known as sort of dedicated hunters. And they also seem to be the two, but this is mostly because nothing's written about them, but they seem to be the two that are most good, if that's the right word. They don't seem to be as evil as the other brothers. None of them have traits of evil. They don't have stories that are intertwined with being evil. They are just hunters. And they live, as I say, at Amun-Areb, far, far, far in the south, or with Caranthir in Thargelion, and at the Dagor Bragollach, they flee south to Amun-Areb. And then in the second Kin-slaying, they survive. They do survive in the second Kin-slaying. However, in the third Kin-slaying, there's a reason why only Maedhros and Maglor reclaim the last two Silmaril, because Amrod and Amras die in the third Kin-slaying at the Haven. I believe it is Syrian. I'm going to go with Syrian. I'm sorry, it's one thing I've not looked up. So Amrod and Amras die. Their only part in the story, once their father has died, is at the Dagor Bragollach, where they're beaten and they flee south, and then they partake in the second Kin-slaying, and then they die in the third, leaving only Maedhros and Maglor. And of course, you all know what happened to Maedhros. He jumped into a chasm, and that therefore leaves Maglor. And Maglor is the only surviving son of the sons of Feanor. And in the same anguish that caused Maedhros to throw himself to his death, Maglor throws his Silmaril into the ocean, wanting nothing more to do with this accursed jewel. And he is then said to wander the shores of Middle-earth for eternity. And don't forget that Maglor was the second greatest singer to ever live, and it is said that often you can hear him lamenting, singing along the shores for what he and his brothers have done. And with the passing of the Silmaril into the ocean, the oath of the brothers is taken away. Of course, after the War of Wrath, many of the Noldor, in fact all of the Noldor, save for Maglor being the only surviving son, the doom of Mandos is lifted, and they are welcome to return to Aman if they wish. Many of them go to Lindon and reside there, but some do go back west. But Maglor walks the shores forever. Now, side notes before we end, a few points to note. A redeeming feature of Maedhros is that at the second Kin-slaying, the agents of Kelegorm, remember being Kelegorm is arguably the most evil of all the sons, despite the fact that Caranthir is called the Dark. But at the second Kin-slaying, when they're attacking Dior, the ruler of Doriath, and his wife Nimloth, their young children, Dior's young children, are taken out into the forest by Kelegorm's servants and abandoned in the forest. And Maedhros thinks this is a step too far, and he tries to find the children, but he can't, and they die. But it shows at least a part of Maedhros is always battling against this inherent evil under the oath. He's trying to do good. Additionally, Maglor has something of a redeeming feature as well, because at the third Kin-slaying, when Elwing throws herself into the ocean, she leaves behind Elrond and Elros. Now, you should all know who those are. And of course, these are the Elrond and Elros are just young children at this time. And Maglor, showing his repentance, actually takes them on. He takes them originally as captives, but then eventually they become as like sons to him. And Maglor essentially raises Elrond and Elros for a large part of their life. So he also does repent a little. But unfortunately, Curufin and Kelegorm are arguably they are so utterly in sway with the oath that they do nothing but bad things. We don't know enough about Amrod and Amras to say on their character. And of course, Caranthir does save the Haladin. But eventually he also succumbs and kills with the Kin-slaying. But that brings the stories of the sons together. Now, obviously, from that episode, there are a million and one things we could talk about. The Dagor Bragollach, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, they could all have videos on their own. But I wanted to just cover the sons. Most likely, because of how much we've spoken of it here and the release of the book, the next episode is going to be the story of Beren and Luthien, or the Lay of Luthien, which is a poem about it. And you can find out more about them, because the only real stories, individual, succinct, complete stories from the First Age, really, is the tale of Beren and Luthien and the tales of the children of Hurin, which is why both of those things have books about them, because there's enough information. So Beren and Luthien will likely be the next episode. But as ever, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. I apologise that there's a lengthier delay between these, but as I've mentioned before, I'm now well into the areas where I know little bits of the story, but I don't know enough to do it off the top of my head anymore, and I have to research these now. So it takes me longer. But any feedback is entirely welcome, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this, and I look forward to discussing Lord of the Rings with you all. But until we speak again, dear friends, Navar Naden Pedamad Melonin, and farewell.